So, the word to you on C5. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk about some issues that I think Luca would have been interested in and that he didn't have a chance to work on, because at the time that he was at Stanford and we were collaborating, those data weren't available that would have given him, in his usual style, a framework for asking theoretical questions. He and I collaborated for 40 years. Most of that time, we worked weekends together and several nights a week. We only lived about 75 meters apart. And I think I got a pretty good idea during that time of the kind of problem that Luca would have been interested in. Many of you know that Luca's work on genetics in the last, I'd say 15 years of his time at Stanford was very much focused on the Y chromosome. And he wrote together with Underhill and Kivisild and several other European collaborators, many papers on the comparison between Y chromosome variation and geography. So let me tell you about the problems that Luca would have been interested in. There are 5 of them. One Walter has referred to, and I'm going to take a little different viewpoint of this from data from ancient DNA, a little bit different from how he phrased it. I'm going to talk about 2 Chinese problems, one from the mainland and one from Taiwan. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some new work that is just now available on our work on cultural transmission. This is a continuation of the theoretical work that Luca and I originated in 1972 and founded the modern theory of cultural evolution. And the last one I want to talk about is something that goes back to the beginning of Luca's career, when he was focused on the evolution of resistance in bacteria. And that was actually the reason that he ended up at Cambridge, because he was finding that it was not simple genetics that you could use to characterize the resistance of bacteria to mutagens, things that made them mutate, but it appeared to be almost a quantitative character. And when he told Fisher about this, Fisher was very interested in quantitative characters. And that's how Luca came to go to Cambridge. That's what he told me. So bacteria was what made him originally famous. His papers with Josh Lederberg on sex and recombination in bacteria really established him as a very important bacterial geneticist. And that's why I think he'd be interested in what we find out in the 5th problem. This first topic has to do with data that are not our data. We took these data from the literature, and it has to do with replacement of farming communities. And we called the issue cultural hitchhiking. And you'll see why we think that the patrilineal kin groups that are actually the Yamnaya groups that Walter referred to formed corporations based on their Y chromosome. And we developed some mathematical and computational models to show what the consequence of that would be and how that would relate to the data on ancient DNA concerning the Y chromosome. And these are the references that you can find about the data that are ancient samples. The genotyping has been done by these groups that you see on the board. Which is the pointer? Which one is the pointer?
I don't know. Is it pointer?
There, I got it. Okay. It's okay. I got it. So, in particular, this one published a very interesting graph based on the use of DNA variation in the X chromosome and in mitochondria to show what the population sizes of these people coming from the Pontic steppes in the Caucasus might have been. Now, what I point out here is their estimates of the population size. This is the population size of Y chromosomes, based on Y chromosomes and based on mitochondria. Now, mitochondria have the property that they're inherited only through the female line. So when you look at the variation in the mitochondria, you can assume that that variation refers to the population of females, whereas the Y chromosome data will refer to the population of males. And there are a whole series of computer packages now. Some have interesting names like BEAST and Skyline plots that people use to take data of this kind, the variation in the Y chromosome, and estimate what the population sizes of the people would have been at various times from now. And of course, they're making assumptions about mutation rates to get the estimates of the numbers of individuals. And the remarkable estimate that has been widely accepted is that the population size of the Y chromosome took this huge dip in Europe at about between 4,500 and 6,000 years ago, which is about the time that Walter was referring to, but Walter was referring mainly to northwestern Europe. So how do you explain this huge drop here in the male populations? Well, you don't see the same drop here at the same time. The female population apparently doesn't drop. Now, I refer you to data that have been discovered on what are the genetic effects of colonization, and particularly violent colonization. Australian Aborigines today have about 75% British chromosomes, Y chromosomes. In the Andean, high Andes populations and South American indigenous people, some groups have 95% Spanish Y chromosomes. But the mitochondria are indigenous mitochondria. So what happens is not that they kill everybody. The colonizers kill the males, the ones who are likely to be fighting. So our explanation, by the way, this is the ratio of females to males that is inferred from what I just told you. So our hypothesis, which leads to a mathematical framework that asks the question, can you have competition between patrilineal descent groups or fraternal kin groups all carrying the same Y chromosome within the group? And that competition leads to reduction in the number of Y chromosomes, different types of Y chromosomes, which, if you had done the work that Battini and Carmen et al. Had done, would lead you to estimate that the population size had actually dropped. But it mightn't have dropped because those Y chromosome corporate groups just might have become big. So you have a relatively few big groups. So the question we asked is, how do you phrase that kind of competition? You do it using mathematical models. Now, the work that had been done by Heyer et al., Evelyn Heyer, who was at Musée de l'Homme in Paris, had done an interesting study where she looked at pastoral populations in Central Asia. Usually she works in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and she finds that those populations exhibit a substantial loss of Y chromosome diversity at the pastoral people compared to farmers, but she doesn't see the same loss in the mitochondria. There's obviously a sex-based phenomenon going on here, and that's what we are claiming. How do you phrase this? It's relatively simple to start. These are haplotypes. They're the genotypes of the Y chromosome. These are the culture groups that are formed. So every individual belongs to one culture group and one haplotype group, so they're in one square. And the competition is going to go on between these different culture groups. If everything is patrilineal, so that being a culture in a culture group is a patriline as well as being a culture group, then they're on the diagonal there. They're exactly like that. Whereas if you had socially complex groups with high intergroup diversity, competition won't remove the diversity. So they're basically, you've got a continuum across this area here, which goes from patrilineal to socially complex. These, I don't want to go into this, though there are some people here who are interested in computation. We did a massive simulation study, literally millions and millions of different variants of the parameters. And these are the results. I want you to focus on this one here. This is the number of individuals going up here, and we started with 10,000 individuals. We introduced mutations on the Y chromosome, and we looked at what happens when you have the competition going on at the cultural corporate group for Y chromosome, what you don't. And this is tracking Y chromosomes. What you see is that the number of Y chromosomal groups under competition drops. So we only have a very few by the end. But the population size hasn't changed. It's up to there. It's still at the same level. What happens if you don't do that? That's what happens if you don't have the competition. You have this large number of different Y chromosome that ends up at the total population size being the same as it was with a limited number of Y chromosomal groups, each of which is quite large. So the original assumptions that go into the computer models that Carmen et al. And those people used to infer what the population size would have been is not very useful. So we did these other examples just to show you that it's not just a shot in the dark, that when you do these simulations over and over again, you find the same consistent results. So it's not just one simulation that did this, but thousands of simulations where we find the same result. Interestingly, the two students who worked with me on this were both undergraduates, and they graduated. One is now doing his PhD in human evolution at Harvard, and the other one doing his PhD in mathematics at Berkeley. Now I'm going to give an example from China where people should have been able to predict this if they had studied the culture carefully. This is a picture of the demographic transition that's happened in China over the past 40 years. What you see here is the total fertility rate, which in the 1960s was up around 4 to 6 children per woman. And the institution of their fertility control policy, which comes to be called the one-child policy, but wasn't a one-child policy. It was a 1.5-child policy. 1.5-child policy means that if the first child was a son, you weren't allowed to have another one. If the first child was a daughter, you were allowed to have another one, especially in the rural areas, and especially if you were a member of one of the 55 non-Han minority groups. So we're down now to the lowest today. It was in the New York Times last week, a very nice article. It is now the lowest fertility rate on the planet is in China. And why is that? It's because there's been a culture change. And they should have seen this coming. Here is the sex ratio. SRB in demography is called the sex ratio at birth. And the sex ratio at birth in China has been dreadful. You can see that in urban areas in 2005, it was 117 boys born for every 100 girls. For the total of the population, in the year 2010, it was up to 119 to 120 boys born for every 100 girls. What has happened over that period of 40 years that the fertility control policy was in existence is the very strong culture of son preference has had tremendous effects on the demography of the country, to the extent that there are many areas in the south and west, far southwest of China, where they haven't had a birth in the village for 10 years. That's because there aren't any marriageable age girls. The marriageable age girls move to the cities to find males who have a little more money, have better prospects, and since it's a bride price culture, males have to pay for a bride. The girls are going to do better with wealthier, better employed males. So this has had tremendous demographic effects, and during that period of time that the 1.5 child policy was in existence, probably 450 to 500 million births were averted, which is a gigantic, it's like 1.5 times the population of the United States would now be on the planet if it hadn't been for that. But the unpredicted ramification was that you had this very skewed sex ratio, and in addition, a culture change that has led the people to react to the change in the fertility policy that was instituted in 2016, which my colleagues and I in Xi'an, where I have a professorship in Xi'an Jiao Tong University, we were pushing the government to get off the 1.5 child, allow 2 children. But they did it too late. They did it too late in 2016, and the reason that it was too late is now everybody doesn't want 2 children. The culture has changed. We've done quite a bit of work on this, and we have projections that it will make almost no difference to the demography now. The 2-child policy, the latest articles in demography have gone through this and shown that it'll make a tiny, tiny difference for a short while. But the aging of the population, it is the fastest aging population on the planet. That is not going to be supportable, and there won't be enough workers. So demographically, there's a real problem for China. Now, when we were working on this, we wanted to know first, could you tell what the sex ratio at birth was for first, second, third, etc. births? And by getting access to the Chinese censuses of 1990, 2000, and 2010, you can see what happens at first birth. First birth, not too bad, a little bit skewed. I mean, normal is about 105 to 100. That's what it is in Europe and America and Australia. But look at the second births. In 2000, 152 boys at the second birth. That means that what is happening is the women are having the second child aborted until they get a boy. And that is illegal. It's illegal in almost all provinces in China. But what does it mean to be illegal? People can do illegal things and get away with it, as you've seen in America. The problem is that it can be a victimless crime. The patient wants it, and the doctor can do it for $6 or $8. So it's done anyway, despite the fact that it's actually illegal to abort for sex selection. Most provinces of China have laws on the book that say it's illegal to abort for sex selective purposes. Now, we did a study in 2 counties in Shanxi province. One is called Sanyuan, which is quite a wealthy agricultural province, and the other one is Luoyang, which is quite a modest income remoter area right on the border of Gansu province. And we asked, what's the sex ratio at birth? The sex ratio at birth is normal in Luoyang and skewed in Sanyuan, 117. The very high sex ratio at birth. Totally normal in Luoyang. Well, what are the ramifications, the cultural ramifications of son preference besides the sex ratio at birth? Well, the first one is notable by where does a boy go, where does a girl go when she gets married? Uxoriolocal marriage is the term anthropologists use for saying that a boy goes to live with a girl's parents. Virilocal marriage is when the girl goes to live with the boy's parents. So that province that had the normal sex ratio at birth has between 30 and 40% of uxoriolocal marriages. So the boy can go and live with the girl's parents, and it's not considered abnormal. However, in the other province, 3 to 6% of the boys go to live with the girl's parents. So the first cultural effect of the son preference is on marriages. Who do you live with? Yet when you ask the people there, who do you want to live with, in both provinces they prefer to live with the son's parents, even though we see that data that you have uxoriolocal marriage. The preference is still there, so it's like almost a contradiction. Now, we then did a survey asking about the preference of the woman for a son. What would you do if you were in the sex selections situation? That is, you had a daughter. What would you do? Would you abort or not? If you didn't, then that indicates you don't have what we called son preference potency. Son preference is behind everything in these communities. So we did a questionnaire which we sent out to 5,000 or 6,000 people in each of the communities, asking the parents and the daughters who are of marriageable age what their preferences were. And Luca and I had done this first time at Stanford with human biology students, about 1,000 of them, in one particular major at Stanford, where we asked the students to tell us who their parents were and who their best friends were, and we asked them questions that they answered and the parents answered. So we were able to look at the correlations between parents and children. So we had some experience in this, which our Chinese colleagues adopted. And what we find here is that in Luoyang, the transmission rate, the cultural transmission rate of not having a preference for son is estimated at about 85%. And in Sanyuan, which had the high sex ratio at birth, it's a quarter as much. So what we did is take that preference, go into formal demographic theory, which is well developed. It's not well developed for this kind of question. It's well developed if you're not dealing with anything cultural. And we went into that and asked what would the consequence for the Chinese population be if the whole population behaved like San Yuan, or if the whole population behaved like Luoyang. So now we're putting into this mathematical prediction the known birth rates from the census, the known survival rates, all of the demography that you get from a census, and project out what would happen if the country as a whole went either to San Yuan or Luoyang. And these two are the San Yuan projections, and these two are the Luoyang projections. So if the country had behaved exactly as it did at the time we did the census, you would end up with a stable sex ratio in China around 130 to 135, which would be really a disaster for the country. So this is one way that you can use cultural transmission that Luca and I proposed in our book to superimpose on demography and make a really, I think, a very useful projection for the society. Now, this word exaptation, the next thing I want to tell you about, was coined by Stephen Jay Gould, a famous evolutionist at Harvard, to talk about something that happens in a biological system that's an indirect consequence of an adaptation at another trait. So it's an inadvertent change due to something that happened for a reason at some other trait. And the exaptation I'm going to talk about has to do, we call it niche construction, and that's already been mentioned today, but we call it cultural niche construction because you can have one cultural trait varying, such as education of women. And on the face of it, education of women shouldn't have anything to do with the sex ratio. But education of women does have an effect on the son preference and the sex ratio of females and on fertility. Now, why should education of women have an effect on fertility? The fertility is actually a part of what is constructed by the education. That's why we call it a cultural niche. The cultural niche is the education of women. Here is our starting point, and we're talking about Taiwan. And the reason we can do this study is because Taiwan was a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945, and the Japanese were meticulous in their data collection. Their data collection consisted of all births, all marriages, all deaths, who was living in the house at the time somebody was born. They were incredibly careful. So we have access to 100,000 such records. And what you find is that before 1895, the mainland Chinese who had migrated to Taiwan were all Han Chinese, the majority dominant culture in China. They have very strong son preference, as I just mentioned, but they also have no usual marriage to speak of. They have almost only virilocal marriage. In addition, they regarded the Aboriginal Chinese, and I'm very interested in these because Luca and I, in 1981, went to Taiwan specifically to visit the Aborigines of Taiwan, who are not Chinese according to their genetic variation. They're actually Melanesian, closer to being Malaysian than they are to Chinese, but we weren't allowed to say that in public at the time. The military actually cautioned us not to say this. But the Han Chinese had a very disreputable habit. In 1895, all girls had bound feet. So foot binding was a custom that was ubiquitous in rural China. Consequences. You see these little shoes here? This big. By binding the girls' feet, they broke all the bones in the feet, and the girls couldn't go out of the house. They couldn't work in the fields. They were essentially housebound. Now, On the other hand, we asked the question, why did the Japanese law, which was passed in Taiwan in 1915, that forbade binding feet? Well, why did that have a huge effect? Look at the effects that it had. First of all, when they stopped doing this, that means they stopped foot binding. One of the things we had data on are the formation of these funereal rites, grave behaviors for the dead people. This is how it was before, and this is how it becomes after foot binding. Those feet had different names, but whichever way you did it, it's absolutely horrendous. Now here is a graph that shows how local marriage rates changed in the Aborigines. The Han regarded the Aborigines as barbarians because they didn't bind feet and they didn't mind having local marriages. But look what happens after foot binding in 1915. Before foot binding, this is the proportion of local marriages. By 1945, among the Aborigines, you've essentially eliminated local marriage. Well, one of the reasons is that the Japanese used the females after foot binding to work in the fields so that the males could work on construction of the roads and things that would improve the infrastructure of Taiwan. So this change in the behavior of the marriages was an exaptation from the ban on foot binding, right? But they're more than that. The spirit medium in the Aborigines prior to foot binding was always a woman. After foot binding, no more women could do that, and that's because there was nobody to look after the children if the women went out working. So when we did the interviews with some very elderly women, they told us that they still thought that the spirit medium should be a woman. But there weren't any women who were spirit medium. They were males. In addition, all of these worship practices changed. So they became oriented towards the Han. So this is why I call it a cultural exaptation from the change that is due to banning foot binding. I don't think anybody would have predicted that at the time that you banned foot binding, that all these culture changes in the Aborigines would occur. I'm not going to talk, I won't have time to talk about this conformity and cultural transmission. If you're interested in this particular work came out online about 10 days ago, and I can tell you how to get it. But I did want to finish with by the way, I saw this in the New Yorker. I think it's a very nice statement by this author, Charles King, that other species are programmed to know how to cope with the world, but our biological endowment evolved to allow us to choose how to respond to our environment. We can't rely on our instincts. We need an instruction manual, and culture is the manual. I think it's a very nice summary. So now I want to just finish up with this last topic that we worked on last year with my colleagues in computer science. Luca would have loved this because of the amount of data that's involved. We looked at 1,840 species for whom there are available data on more than 8.5 million protein-protein interactions. Protein-protein interactions are studied widely in some specific species. Bacteria is one of the easiest ones that people have found it can be done, but yeast is also very well done, and you find far fewer studies in archaea and eukaryotes, not so many studies. Now, when you do this protein-protein interaction, you can form a network, which is one of the major things that people involved in artificial intelligence and machine learning are working on, the structure of networks. And after we saw this data, we asked ourselves, what is important about the structure of those networks of protein-protein interactions? And we were able to get a good framework that when people have more data on eukaryotes and archaea, the species higher than bacteria, we'll be able to tell a lot more. So a network is simply a set of nodes, which we call V, and they're the protein coding genes. And the edges are the interactions. Just, is there an interaction between them? So if you're a computer scientist, this is one of the things you have a tool in trade to study networks. Now what we did is we asked how fragmented the interaction network becomes when you just randomly remove a certain fraction of the edges, just chop them off. Does the network collapse? How do you measure the resilience? And those of you who are physicists will recognize we start to use the information measure, Shannon's information measure here. And we ask, if you take this measure and we call it resilience, resilience means how well you preserve the underlying structure of most of the network in the face of having a certain fraction chopped off, just by breaking that connection between a couple of proteins. And that resilience is really interesting because what we find is that Haemophilus influenzae, which is one of the bacteria, that fragments very quickly as you chop the network. The network just breaks up into little pieces. Whereas the human interactome, and we call this the interactome now, it's how the proteins interact. The human interactome is pretty stable to chopping off bits. In fact, in our paper we found these 4 conclusions. 1, the total branch length from the top, the root of the tree, to the end of all the leaves is the same thing as saying larger evolutionary distance gives you more resilience to damage in the network. Bacteria with more resilient interactomes seem to have significantly more regulatory genes. Those are genes that don't make proteins but control how much and when proteins being made. That bacteria living in complex habitats have the highest resilience. Aerobic bacteria, those that are actually out of the water or living on a surface where there's air and oxygen. Host-associated bacteria have the lowest resilience. Those that need to be for their reproduction inside a host have the lowest resilience. And that's dependent very strongly on oxygen. And this is because when the people did those 1,580 bacteria networks, they made a note of whether the bacteria was dependent for its survival on oxygen. So we're able to tell those sorts of things. And finally, those resilient interactomes, as you might expect, can harbor many neutral mutations in the genes that don't have a big effect on the interactome itself. So these are the problems that I wanted to tell you about. If you're interested in the cultural evolution of conformity, that is behaving like the majority of the population behaves, that's a different story, and you can access it by going online to theoretical population biology. Thanks for your attention.